Greetings, everyone. I wish I could have been there in person to deliver this message, but unfortunately that wasn't to be this time. I'd like to thank Mike and the Justice for Men and Boys organization for inviting me to do this video talk for this year's conference and for all their hard work, both for the conference and all they do on behalf of men and boys and the women who love them. And you know, that work is really a remarkable thing. It boggles the mind when you think about it. We've become part of a philosophy that opposes long-standing and intense social programming to ignore men's issues in the name of forever putting women and all other groups first. The ideas we embrace are healthy, functional, and corrective to social problems, yet are viewed by the general population as pathological and even dangerous. Thanks in part to the fake news media, we've been labeled as haters, even though our work demonstrates that we are, in fact, rejecting hatred and hateful ideology. That's life for MRAs, and more broadly red-pilled people, and it's often marked by loneliness, isolation, and varying degrees of frustration. Compounding that is the fact that our lives require us to assume the daunting task of rejecting the pathological, unhealthy obsession on the issues of women, known as gynocentrism, in a world that will punish you for doing so. Mind you, I'm fully aware that you're hearing me talk about this right now in a country that at one time produced the likes of the great Winston Churchill, but that now imprisons people for telling jokes and practicing journalism. It's hard to forge ahead under these conditions. Or is it? Among other things, that's a question I want to explore, and I'd like to offer some reflections on the modern men's movement, which I see as actually two movements, one personal, the other political. To do that, we have to start with some bad news. Actually, some really bad news. If you're looking for a clear-cut watershed victory for men and boys on any large scale, political or social, you can quit wasting your time. It's never going to happen. There will never be a men's rights victory parade, nor broad legislation that corrects problems faced by men and boys, nor a sweeping shift in public consciousness and sentiment that overrides the destructive human impulse to regard women as entitled and privileged, as an ever-fragile, protected class without agency or accountability. The reasons for that are simple and inescapable. As they say, without men, civilization would only last till the next oil change. Society piles complete and total responsibility on men for its very existence. Almost all the sacrifice of blood and sweat and of life that is required to keep the world turning, to keep us living in relative comfort and safety, is male sacrifice. Women won't do it. Women can't do it. And I know to say that is heresy, as is often the case with the truth these days. But truth, as any MRA can tell you, is a cruel master. It's brutal and unforgiving. It cares not for mainstream sensibilities, and it exists in complete indifference to our feelings. And with the harshness of these uncomfortable truths comes some uncomfortable realities, like the fact that in society, men's vulnerabilities will always be overshadowed by expectations for them to protect, provide, and perform. Prioritizing the issues of men and boys, caring about them, will always be perceived as a threat to women, a threat to the state, and a certain pathway to destabilizing society. Therefore, the organized correction of men's issues will be treated as strictly verboten for as far as we can see into the future. Just ask the SPLC. Society, that being men and women working together, forever strives to keep men uneducated and unaware of their own condition, to brainwash men into believing that taking care of themselves is a form of cowardice. Men who are conscious of this are more difficult to exploit, which is to say that most men are like hardwood floors. You can walk on them forever. The modern men's movement, though, is the one and only alternative to that line of dysfunctional thinking, but getting there is not without problems. Strangely, in a world as polarized as it can be politically, religiously, and in most other ways humans devised to square off from each other in camps, the deference to those who advocate for women and chastise men is one area of near unanimity. The world agrees on what we know about men. Men don't have problems. Men are the problem. Men have too much power and should be on a mission to yield that power to anyone who demands it. Men need to quit pretending they have problems that matter. Man up and help others. Hopefully, when men die, they do it in an act of bravery, making sure someone else gets to live. If you think I'm exaggerating, you're not paying attention. We're all familiar with the ubiquitous superabundance of male shortcomings, men's addiction to power, their incapacity for love and intimacy, their inability to articulate their feelings to the satisfaction of a feminist mental health industry, their innate and destructive aggressiveness. The list of stereotypes is all but unending, sufficiently dehumanizing men so that they can be exploited without remorse or reconsideration. Driven by pure social force, diseases, suicide, homelessness, educational failure, addictions, all predominantly, overwhelmingly male problems, are hidden behind the fabricated false veneer of men's supposed power and privilege. Meanwhile, as the world ever sharpens its ability to impugn men's very existence, our war zones and blue-collar graveyards still run with the blood of men. The dirty, dangerous work required to maintain our society is written in the cut and calloused hands of men. Even in the sometimes deadly battlefield of the human psyche, where casualties are reflected in suicide statistics, we find that that too is a man's world. And rather than have compassion for any of this, society is more prone to mock and ridicule men who are uppity enough to talk about it. It's almost enough to make you throw in the towel or raise a white flag. More frankly, all this explains why so many men never even join the fight, why we have so few in a movement trying to do for men what most are too timid, too indoctrinated, or too self-loathing to do for themselves. Even then, because men are so awesome and capable on behalf of anyone but themselves, because they're willing to do whatever needs to be done so that everyone else gets a better deal, because we're so dependent on their sacrifices, we will always blind ourselves to their suffering. We will always ignore their problems and will likely always shun them for daring to discuss these things. Decades of involvement with men's issues and the lifelong study of human sexual behavior leave me convinced that this will never change across the board for human beings. But even in the midst of all this apparent pessimism, the conclusion I have that matters is not one of hopelessness at all. In fact, it's just the opposite. The fact is that human males are indeed awesome creatures. Some are capable of casting off the shroud of ignorance and hate in which modern society wraps masculinity, and rebelling in a healthy way. How many? We don't know. But the very existence of this movement, its refusal to die, speaks to that truth. Many men can't be reached, of course. Some are just too steeped in the self-destructive tradition of unconscious, servile masculinity. They are destined to go from cradle to grave as obedient zombies, unable to imagine life outside the toxic role prescribed for them by a parasitic society. And let's face it, that is the average man. In understanding that the average man, much like the average woman, is a lost cause, we can and should take solace in the fact that the men's movement is a movement for exceptional people. It is a movement that serves as a life-sustaining intellectual and emotional refuge for remarkable people in an unremarkable world. I'd borrow from the social justice crowd and call it a safe space. But safe spaces are built on comfortable lies, embraced by weak people to shield them from the real world. The safety of the men's movement resides in the fact that MRAs have the strength to deal with reality. Our safety is in our values and in our spines, which is why after years of mainstream media attacks and campaigns of disinformation, we are still here with ideas that cannot be killed or ignored by everyone. If that sounds self-congratulatory, it certainly should. If you are sitting there as a man or a woman watching this, knowing that you're cut from a different, more conscious cloth, that you don't fit into the blue pill world and that you don't want to, knowing that you equally recognize the humanity of both men and women and that you possess a depth of compassion and caring that extends to places and people ignored by the rest of the world, then you are exceptional. Your character is the character of the men's movement. The rest of this lying world be damned. That brings us to the purely personal side of this movement, the fact that one of our most redeeming and valuable features is that we offer men a clear path away from personal destruction. We benefit from one simple truth. The greatest majority of men's issues, including matters of their human rights, can be effectively addressed by men's personal choices. Matter of fact, that's so important I want to say it again. The greatest majority of men's issues, including matters of their human rights, can be effectively addressed by their personal choices. Likewise, the greatest threats to men's rights is their own choices, almost always driven by a lopsided and rigged social contract with women. We understand the pitfalls of that contract very well, especially when codified in law by marriage. False allegations, suicide, parental alienation, ruinous divorces, restraining order abuses, male financial exploitation, destructive, personality-disordered women whose evil acts are enabled by society, and the bias that invariably turns against men when they are engaged in conflict with a woman. Understanding these problems and the readily available solutions isn't complicated once you rise above the blue pill fog. The trick is in practicing the resolve and the courage to carry this message to men in plain public view with shameless abandon. And that message, to its core, is anti-matrimonial. We need to teach men, reaching them at the youngest ages possible, that marriage, as it stands, is cancer. It is painfully easy and equally obvious to see how so many of men's issues, including suicide, is connected to marriage and divorce. And I'm asserting that marriage and divorce each stand alone as separate and distinct problems in the lives of men. Divorce can wreck a man's social, professional, and financial life and can even rob him of his freedom. Marriage can destroy his soul. This isn't a playful joke about the stresses of married life. It's a deadly serious statement about life in a world that socializes women to be opportunistic parasites in the lives of men. A contract between a man and a woman that starts with a man on bended knee, making a demonstration of his ability and willingness to provide for the desires of the woman, including the frivolous, is the same contract that a leech has with your leg. Think about that for a moment. Picture that iconic scene of a man kneeling, presenting a diamond in hopes of being loved. If you have any honesty at all, you know that his rights are gone right then and there. He doesn't have to wait for a family court judge to smash down the gavel and make it official. He is coming to the relationship literally on his knees, offering sacrifice and hoping for nothing but to have that sacrifice accepted. It's his mentality as a man, his sense of his place in the world that's the problem. Society teaches men, often savagely, that if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. Women frequently reinforce that aphorism as though it were a God-given right. That's not a shot at women, though. As with every other socio-sexual malady in modern times, it is a product of men and women working cooperatively. The men's movement offers an honest, if sometimes brutal, critique of both sexes. But unlike feminism, Our answers don't come from demonizing half the population, while we concoct outlandish theories about why we're not responsible for our own shortcomings and our own decisions. Most of us understand that true victims are rare. Most of our problems are of our own making. Most of our answers are in the mirror, and that is where this movement becomes highly personal. One very direct solution we have is men checking out and going their own way, which they are currently doing in impressive numbers. And if you're wondering that I'm saying that MGTOW is the men's movement, you better believe I am. It is the largest, most functional part of it. It is, in the truest sense, the movement of men, away from toxic expectations, away from rigged contracts, and away from ways of thinking that create a belief that we are beholden to women. Men going their own way don't agree to produce children just to have them taken away. They don't get their property stolen by the state and given to a woman. They don't live, as many men do, watching their interests, their friendships, and their dreams slowly erode till they disappear. They don't start contracts on their knees, so they don't end up on their knees or flat on their backs when it's over. By owning their lives and actions, MGTOW are reminding us every day that there are no victims, just volunteers.